The People of Sparks, sequel to The City of Ember, written by Jeanne DuPrau. The final chapter, Chapter 29, 3 Amazing Visits. Lena gave up on trying to persuade Mrs. Murdo to move to the hotel. Since they had all their own houses sooner or later, they might as well stay at the doctor's house till then. Besides, Mrs. Murdo was so intent on learning to be the assistant doctor that it seemed unkind to take her away. Lena and Maddie took on the job of harvesting and preserving the produce from the doctor's vegetable garden. Every morning they picked baskets of tomatoes and beans and peppers and corns and squash. Every afternoon they sliced tomatoes and laid them in the sun to dry. They took dried beans out of their pods and put them in jars. They cooked peppers and packed them in olive oil. They tied bunches of herbs with string and hung them up to dry. Poppy puttered around their feet, helping by sprinkling dry leaves here and there or banging spoons on pots. Even Torrin, whose feet were healing, often chose to hang around with Lena and Maddie. He said he knew how to make a garlic braid, so they gave him a basket of garlic and he made one. One afternoon, as Lena and Maddie were cutting green beans for dinner, Lena heard wheels crunching on the road outside. The next moment she heard the ruffling of an oxen. And then Torrin sprang up and limped as fast as he could to the front of the house. Uh-oh, thought Lena. Is it who I think it is? It was. There was Casper's battered truck, and there was Casper just climbing out of it. He looked grubby. His mustache drooped. Torrin ran toward him, crying, "Casper! Casper!" Casper smiled in a tired way. "Hey, brother," he said. He thumped Torrin's back a couple of times. Then he stared toward the house. Lena and Maddie went out to meet him. When he saw them, he stopped and glared. "Deserters," he said. But he didn't seem to have the energy to berate them further. He trudged into the house and plunked down on the couch. Torrin plunked down beside him. "I've been waiting and waiting for you," Torrin said. "Why didn't you come back with them?" He flicked his hand toward Lena and Maddie. "I had important work to do," said Casper, which they didn't want to help with. "And what happened with your work?" asked Maddie, standing by the door. "Did you find what you wanted to find?" Casper didn't even look at her. He closed his eyes and slumped against the back of the couch. "My numbers," he said, "they need readjusting. They were completely right except for one thing." "What thing was that?" asked Maddie. "Wrong city," said Casper, still without opening his eyes. "I have reworked the numbers. Tomorrow I head north." Lena and Maddie exchanged a look. Casper turned his head toward Maddie and squinted at her. "I don't suppose you want to come," he said. "No, thank you," said Maddie. "I plan to stay here, where something with real potential is beginning." Torrin tugged on Casper's arm. "Did you bring me something this time?" he asked. Casper opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling for a while. "Well, yes," he said, "I did." "What?" shrieked Torrin. "What is it? Can I have it now?" "It's out in the truck," said Casper. "I found a whole crate of them. Very unusual. You can have one." "One what?" "Let's go get it!" Torrin darted to the door. Casper heaved himself up and they went outside. Lena watched as Casper rooted around in one of his crates. He came up with something she recognized with a start. She hadn't seen one for a long time. It was like seeing something that belonged to an old friend, now dead. "What is it?" said Torrin. "A light bulb," said Casper. "I found a case of 48 of them, all unused." "But what does it do?" Torrin asked, peering into the light bulb as if he expected to see something alive in there. He tapped the glass with his fingernail. "It gives light," said Casper, "if you have electricity." "But we don't have electricity." "That's right," Casper said wearily. "So you hold on to it, in case someday we do." Torrin went to the window seat and sat there turning the bulb around and around in his hands. Lena watched him, thinking about Ember. People had figured it out once, she thought. They would figure it out again. A few days after Casper left, there was another visitor at the doctor's house. Lena was out in the courtyard at the time, cracking walnuts with a rock. She saw someone approaching the gate, a bent figure walking slowly and somehow crookedly. She stood up. The person seemed to be having trouble with the gate latch, so she went to help. and that was when she realized it was Ben Barlow. His injured arm was bandaged and strapped to his side, and the jacket he wore draped over it with a sleeve hanging empty. That is why he looked lopsided. "Good afternoon," said Ben. "I was wondering if Torrin is here." "He is," said Lena. "I'll get him." She found Torrin out in the back of the house, sitting under a tree eating a hunk of bread. "Your uncle has come to see you," she said. Torrin stared at her. "My uncle?" He sounded both excited and scared. He jumped up, shoving the bread into his pocket. When Ben saw Torrin coming toward him, he frowned. Then, as if catching himself, he changed his expression to a smile. "Hello, nephew," he said. "How are you getting on?" Torrin looked weary. "Fine," he said. "Good," said Ben. He stroked his beard. Lena wondered if that is all he had to say. Torrin filled the silence. "Is your arm still attached to you?" he said. "Yes," said Ben, "just barely." He started to frown into the air again, and then thought better of it. He sat down on a bench. "Well," he said, "I thought I'd just come to see you. Haven't seen you for a while." "Years," said Torrin. "Well, yes. Busy life, you know, being a town leader. Many decisions to make, matters of right and wrong to grapple with." "Oh," said Torrin. Lena could tell he was thinking the same thing she was. "Why has he come?" "Sometimes one makes the right decision," said Ben. "Sometimes not." "I guess so," said Torrin. Ben readjusted his bandaged arm. Lena saw that his beard was not as neatly trimmed as usual. Probably he had a hard time doing it with his left hand. She was pretty sure Ben didn't have a wife. She never heard mention of one. "Well," said Ben, "you were fortunate, weren't you, getting pulled out of that tree?" "Yes," said Torrin. "I am forced to acknowledge," said Ben, "that it was my fault, that fire." "I guess so," said Torrin. "An accident," said Ben, "but one that did not have to happen." "Uh-huh," said Torrin. Ben got to his feet with painful slowness. "So," he said, "enjoyable talking with you. No doubt we should get to know each other. You must come by for a visit sometime, though I'm of course rarely home." "You're very busy," said Torrin. "That's right," said Ben. He made his way toward the gate with his limping step. As he went out he waved over his shoulder with his good hand, but he didn't turn around. Slowly he started back toward the village. "That was an apology," Lena said to Torrin when Ben was gone. "He's sorry for doing what he did. I guess he's sorry for not being a good uncle, too. For not taking you to live with him." "Live with him?" said Torrin. He made a horrible face. "Well, I thought you weren't happy living with Dr. Hester," Lena said. "You never seem very happy." "I'm too happy," said Torrin crossly. He sat down on the bench that Ben had just left and pulled the hunk of bread from his pocket. A few little birds were hopping nearby. Absently, Torrin tossed them some crumbs. He seemed to be thinking. "I like it here," he said to Lena, and he looked up with her with eyes all round, as if he'd only just discovered this himself. The next day, Dune came to the door of the doctor's house carrying a sack. Kenny was with him, standing slightly behind Dune and peering curiously past him into the room. "I have to show you this," Dune said to Lena. "I made it with a present you brought me." "He's kind of a genius," Kenny said. "He already showed me." Dune set the sack on the window seat. It was only just after dinner time, but the days were shorter now and the sun was nearly down. Dr. Hester had already lit 2 candles. She and Mrs. Murdo and Mattie were sitting at the table shelling lima beans. Poppy was sitting with them, tearing the bean pods into little pieces. All 4 came over to see what Dune had brought. Torrin came too. He was actually more interested in showing Dune what he had than in seeing what was in the sack. "I got a present from Casper," he said. "Great," said Dune, but he wasn't really listening. Lena could see how excited he was about whatever was in the sack. His eyes shone in the candlelight, and his hands fidgeted impatiently with the string around the sack's neck. When he got it untied, he reached into the sack and brought out a small device made of wood and metal. Some sort of machine, Lena thought. It had a coil of wire, and inside the coil she saw a magnet she'd given to Dune. There was a handle that looked as if it could make something turn. Lena, not being much interested in machines, was a little disappointed. It was clear that Torrin was disappointed too. "Want to see my present from Casper?" he said. "In a minute," said Dune. "Let me show you this first." "What does it do?" Lena asked. "Is it some kind of can opener?" asked Mrs. Murdo. "Or it's a sort of mixer?" said the doctor. "Or a drill?" said Maddie. "Nope," said Dune happily, and Kenny, his face shining with the shared secret, whispered "Nope" too. "You won't believe it," Dune went on, "but it makes electricity. I found the directions for it in a book called Science Projects, but I couldn't try it out before because I didn't have a magnet. I didn't even know what a magnet was, but then you brought me one, Lena, and just the other day I remembered about this project." He took the machine over to the table and set it down. "What you do, you turn this crank, and that turns the magnet, and that generates the electricity and runs down these wires. It's supposed to be enough to light a light bulb. The trouble is, I can't test it because I couldn't find any light bulbs that weren't broken." Torrin started jumping up and down. He pounded on Dune's arm. "My present from Casper! My present from Casper!" he yelled. He bolted into the medicine room. "What's the matter with—" said Dune, but Lena broke in. "Dune," she said, "his present from Casper was a light bulb, unused." Torrin came out of the medicine room carrying the light bulb encased in both hands, walking now fast, but with stiff legs, being extremely careful. "You won't break it, will you?" he said to Dune. "Your experiment won't blow it up, will it?" Dune gazed at the light bulb as if it was the most wonderful thing he'd ever seen. Gingerly he reached for it. "I'll be very, very careful," he said. "You can help me, Torrin. Hold the bulb right here." He showed Torrin where to put the bulb, and he wound 2 loose wires around its metal end. "Now," he said, "blow out the candles." Lena blew them out. The room went dark. Dune began turning the crank of his machine. At first nothing happened except the magnet turned around. Dune cranked faster and faster, and a glimmer appeared in the light bulb. First a glimmer, and then a glow, and then the bulb shone with a faint but steady white light. Lena shrieked. Poppy shrieked too, because Lena had, and both the doctor and Mrs. Murdo gasped and broke into applause. Kenny beamed, glancing between the light bulb and Dune's face. Torrin was being too careful to make a noise, but his eyes grew wide and his mouth dropped open. For almost 3 minutes, until his hand got tired, Dune turned the crank of his machine around and around. The doctor wagged her head in wonder. Mrs. Murdo turned her face away to hide the tears, and Torrin held on tight to the light bulb even though it was getting very warm. Lena gazed at the light shining on everyone's faces, full to the brim with hope and love and joy. She watched the little light bulb shining like a promise in the night.